When Barron Trump gave up his first-class seat to an elderly veteran, no one could have anticipated the astonishing family secret that would be revealed mid-flight. What followed left the entire cabin in stunned silence. The overhead cabin lights flickered faintly as passengers found their seats, a familiar blend of pre-flight excitement and mild disorder filling the air. It was a crisp morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, and Flight 247 to Newark was at full capacity. Among the many travelers was a young man seated in first class, his face instantly recognizable to many, though his composed demeanor suggested he preferred otherwise. Barron Trump, now a teenager towering over 6 feet tall, sat by the window, quietly flipping through the pages of a hard-covered book. Unlike others in his family, he was seldom seen in public, but the name on his boarding pass ensured he would never go unnoticed. Just across the aisle, an elderly man in his late 70s carefully made his way to the economy section. His silver hair was neatly combed, his back slightly hunched, his pace steady yet deliberate. He clutched his boarding pass in one hand while holding onto a well-worn leather duffel bag with the other. As he walked past, fellow passengers exchanged knowing glances. His military jacket, decorated with faded patches and distinguished medals, spoke volumes of his past service and sacrifice. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about the life he had lived, while others simply admired the quiet dignity in his every step. He eventually reached his assigned seat near the rear of the plane, wedged between a chatty businessman and a restless toddler. Meanwhile, the flight attendants efficiently moved up and down the aisle, ensuring everyone was ready for departure. Just as the cabin door closed, a sudden moment of unease rippled through the air. The elderly veteran seatmate appeared visibly unsettled, insisting on a seat change. The veteran, clearly apologetic for the inconvenience, tried to defuse the situation, but the minor commotion had already drawn Barron's attention from the comfort of his first-class seat. He leaned slightly into the aisle, his brows furrowed in thought, watching the scene unfold. Then, without hesitation, he pressed the call button for a flight attendant. "Excuse me," Barron said gently when she arrived. "Would it be possible for me to switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The flight attendant blinked, momentarily taken aback. A few first-class passengers lifted their eyes from newspapers and tablets, curiosity sparked. Barron's unexpected request stood in stark contrast to the entitlement often associated with privilege, but his expression was sincere, his voice carrying a quiet determination that left little room for refusal. "Let me check," the attendant replied, her tone tinged with surprise as she walked toward the back of the plane. As Barron stood to retrieve his carry-on bag, a murmur spread through first class. A woman seated nearby leaned in slightly. "You don't have to do that, you know," she remarked, her voice laced with confusion. "You paid for this seat." Barron merely smiled and shrugged. "Some people deserve it more." What happened next would alter the atmosphere of the entire flight. Moments later, the flight attendant returned, her expression a blend of curiosity and admiration. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she informed Barron, her voice carrying the slightest tremor. It wasn't every day that someone willingly gave up a first-class seat, let alone a teenager with a surname that commanded attention. Barron smiled politely and nodded, grabbing his bag before making his way toward the back. Passengers whispered as he passed, some nudging their neighbors to confirm what they had just witnessed. A few discreetly reached for their phones, subtly snapping photos of the unexpected moment. But Barron appeared unaffected, his focus solely on the man seated near the rear of the plane. When Barron reached the elderly veteran, the man looked up, his expression puzzled. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked, his voice aged yet steady. "You really don't have to do this for me." "I want to," Barron replied, extending a hand. "Thank you for your service. Please, take my seat." For a moment, the veteran hesitated, as if weighing the decision in his mind, but the sincerity in Barron's eyes was undeniable. Slowly, the man stood, gripping Barron's hand firmly. "Well, thank you," he said with quiet gratitude. "That's mighty kind of you." As the veteran made his way toward first class, the murmurs among passengers grew louder. A young mother in row 15 leaned toward her teenage daughter, whispering in awe, "Did you see that? He just gave up his seat." The businessman beside Barron arched a brow. "Never seen anything like that on a flight," he muttered, half to himself. Barron settled into his newly acquired economy seat, adjusting his tall frame to fit the cramped space. Completely unfazed, he ignored the lingering stares and quietly reopened his book. A flight attendant passed by and discreetly asked if he needed anything, but Barron simply shook his head before returning to his reading. Meanwhile, up in first class, the veteran gingerly settled into the plush seat. Overcome by both the comfort and the unexpected act of kindness, he adjusted the armrest, his hands trembling slightly as he absorbed the moment. A flight attendant approached him, offering a complimentary drink and a warm blanket, a small gesture in response to a much greater one. "The young man said you should have this seat," she explained gently. The veteran's lips curved into a faint smile. "It's been a long time since anyone has treated me like this," he murmured. His gaze drifted toward the economy section where Barron now sat, completely absorbed in his book. The gesture itself had been simple, but its significance was immeasurable. For a brief moment, the tension from boarding seemed to dissolve. The atmosphere in the cabin softened as passengers settled into their seats. The plane taxied to the runway, and as the engines roared to life, lifting the aircraft into the sky, it seemed like the moment had passed. But the story was far from over. What began as a quiet act of generosity was about to take a turn no one could have foreseen. Then the veteran spoke. At cruising altitude, the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin. Flight attendants moved through the aisles offering drinks and snacks, but the air was anything but routine. Passengers continued to steal glances, eyes shifting between Barron Trump in the cramped economy section and the elderly veteran now resting in first class. Whispers of admiration had already spread, but what came next would deepen the impact of what had just taken place. At first, the veteran sat quietly, sipping his water and staring out the window. His hands rested on his lap, a faint tremor visible in his fingers. Then, as if stirred by the weight of the moment, he turned to the passenger beside him, a middle-aged woman with warm, attentive eyes. "I need to say something," he began, his voice low but steady. The woman tilted her head slightly, intrigued. The veteran adjusted a small pin on his lapel, a purple heart, its edges worn from time, and let out a heavy sigh. "That young man who gave me this seat, his family once saved my life." The woman blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. The veteran leaned back, his voice gaining strength as he began his story. "It was decades ago, during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas, far from home with no one to turn to. I was badly wounded, shot twice in the leg. When I finally made it back to the States, I was lost. No direction, no purpose, nothing." His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "I ended up in New York, trying to piece my life back together. I had nowhere to stay, barely enough for a meal. Then one day, I met a man outside a diner. He could see I was struggling, but he didn't just toss me $1 and move on. He sat with me. He listened to my story." The veteran's eyes darkened with memory, his voice filled with quiet reverence. "That man was Donald Trump's father, Fred." A collective hush fell over the nearby passengers. A few, who had been discreetly eavesdropping, leaned in closer. "Fred Trump?" the woman asked, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fascination. The veteran nodded, his gaze distant. "Yes, he didn't owe me a thing, but he made sure I had a roof over my head and a job to help me get back on my feet. He never asked for anything in return, just told me, 'You served this country, it's the least we can do.' I never forgot those words." By now more passengers had taken notice. The quiet conversations in first class had faded into a concentrated silence. as people absorbed the unexpected revelation. The veteran exhaled, his voice growing firmer. "I always wanted to thank his family, but life went on and I never got the chance. I thought that moment had passed forever, and now today, his grandson just gave me a gift I'll never be able to repay." He shook his head slowly, his eyes misting with emotion. What are the odds of something like this happening? In economy, Barron remained unaware of the murmurs now spreading through the cabin. He remained focused on his book, his long frame awkwardly folded into the cramped seat. But in first class, the veteran's words had sparked something profound. Passengers exchanged glances, the weight of the story sinking in. A flight attendant who had overheard the conversation stepped forward hesitantly. "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" she asked softly. The veteran hesitated, then with a small shake of his head he replied, "No, not yet. Let the boy have his peace. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me, not right now." But the passengers couldn't contain their astonishment. What had started as a simple moment of generosity now carried a sense of fate, as if history itself had aligned to bring this moment full circle. And then something even more remarkable happened. For a few moments, the veteran sat in silence, his story hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. The weight of it had settled over the cabin, turning what had been a routine flight into something far more meaningful. It was the man seated across from the veteran who finally broke the silence. He was in his early 40s, his face lined with exhaustion, but kind in expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice steady yet thick with emotion. "But your story really struck a chord with me. My grandfather served in Vietnam too. He always used to say how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help. Hearing what Fred Trump did for you, well, that's rare. Too rare." The veteran nodded, his lips curling into a faint but knowing smile. "It's the little things, son," he said quietly. "People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go." "Back then, I thought my life was over," the veteran admitted, his voice tinged with reflection. "But that man's kindness gave me a second chance." Across the aisle, a young mother cradling a sleeping toddler chimed in. "You know, my dad used to say the same thing. He wasn't a veteran, but he always told me that when someone lifts you up, even just a little, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction. What Barron did today, it's proof that kindness still matters." The veteran's gaze softened as he listened. "It's true," he nodded, "and it's not just about grand gestures. Sometimes, just being seen, being acknowledged, that can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me, and today his grandson has done the same." Passengers continued to share their thoughts, each story more heartfelt than the last. A flight attendant, visibly moved, lowered herself onto the armrest of an empty seat nearby. "I wasn't going to say anything," she admitted, "but my brother served in Iraq. He didn't talk much about it, but when he came home, he told me something. The people who stopped to thank him, the ones who helped in small ways, those were the moments that stuck with him. Sometimes those moments were the only thing keeping him going." The veteran nodded in understanding, his expression turning wistful. "Your brother's right. It's the little things that keep you grounded when everything else feels like it's falling apart." In economy, Barron noticed a few passengers glancing back at him, their faces filled with admiration and gratitude. He didn't yet understand the full weight of what was happening, but he acknowledged one woman with a polite nod. That simple gesture, so small, had sparked a cascade of memories, emotions, and connections that no one on board could have predicted. The veteran turned to the flight attendant. "You know," he said, "I've always believed that gratitude doesn't end with the person who helps you. It grows. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life, and ever since, I've tried to honor that by helping others. Today, Barron reminded me of that mission. Funny how life works." The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting everyone slightly. But the mood in the cabin remained steady. Conversations continued, a shared catharsis passing through the passengers as if an invisible thread of kindness, gratitude, and human resilience connected them all. Then, as the plane began its descent, the most unexpected moment of all unfolded. As Newark came into view, the first-class cabin grew quiet. The veterans sat still, hands folded in thought, staring out at the skyline. Around the plane, passengers exchanged knowing glances, many still marveling at how a simple act had turned into something much more profound. Just as the captain announced the final approach, a flight attendant approached Barron in economy. She knelt slightly, meeting his eye level. "I wanted to tell you something," she said softly. "The gentleman you gave your seat to, he shared something extraordinary about your family. Would you like to hear it?" Barron looked up from his book, curiosity flickering in his eyes. He slowly closed the cover, the title unreadable to those around him. "Sure," he replied, his voice calm but intrigued. The attendant hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped him at one of the lowest points in his life. He gave him a place to live, a job, expecting nothing in return. And today, you did something for him that reminded him of that kindness." Barron was silent for a moment. His expression remained composed, but his eyes softened slightly, as if the weight of the revelation was settling over him. Finally he said, "That's something, isn't it?" The flight attendant smiled. "It is. I thought you should know." As the plane touched down, the veteran stood, preparing to disembark. To everyone's surprise, he walked straight toward economy, his eyes scanning the rows until they landed on Barron. The young man, now standing to retrieve his bag, looked up in surprise. The veteran extended his hand. "Young man, I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today, it brought me full circle. Your family has a history of kindness, and you've carried that forward. Never forget how much these moments matter." Barron shook his hand firmly, his voice steady but quiet. "I didn't do anything special, sir. You deserved it." The cabin fell silent. Passengers watched, some with misty eyes, others with quiet smiles of admiration. The connection between these two men, generations apart, felt like a living testament to the power of kindness and gratitude. As passengers disembarked, many paused to thank Barron for his gesture. Others approached the veteran, offering handshakes and words of appreciation for his service. The atmosphere was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced on a flight before. At the gate, the veteran turned one last time, tipping his hat toward Barron. "You've got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose that." Barron nodded, his usual reserved demeanor softening just enough to reveal the impact of those words. As he walked toward baggage claim, he pulled out his phone and typed a brief message. He hesitated, then hit send. The text read, "Grandpa would have been proud of today." This story is a reminder of how one small act of kindness can ripple far beyond its moment, connecting people in ways we never anticipate. Kindness, gratitude, and empathy, these are the values that transcend time and place, creating bonds that endure. If this story inspired you, don't forget to share it. Let's keep the conversation going and remind the world that kindness still matters. And if you'd like more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join us next time for another unforgettable journey.